Greetings. This is Mark Cushing, and welcome back to the next edition of podcast Mark 5 that are produced by the Veterinary Virtual Care Association. And we haven't done this since the summer of 2020, which was the year that we began the Veterinary Virtual Care Association in the unknown and uncertain time of COVID. And we've learned a few things in 3 years, and an awful lot's happened. So the first podcast is really going to catch people up. I don't expect most viewers get up every day and try to figure out what's happened with the VCPR and veterinary telemedicine. And after you watch this, you won't need to. Hopefully, you'll have a good sense of things. And that's where we stand, in July of 2023, halfway through the year. And it's been a very busy year. You can't describe the status of telemedicine and cover every practice and where things stand with all clinicians and all veterinarians and pet owners. That's one by one. But in general, we've had the challenge for 3 years with the shortage of veterinarians and the shortage of support staff that it's put a lot of pressure on practices who might otherwise want to use telemedicine to frankly find the time and the resources to make their decisions and how they want to implement it. So I would describe the status of telemedicine inside veterinary practices across the United States as a work in process or unfinished. And I think there are many veterinarians, and this is from conversations across the country over the past 3 years, there's many veterinarians and practices. It's not so much that the verdict is out, they're just not yet at a place that they can make the decision to implement what will be for them the most effective tool. But as legislatures take action and open the door, in some cases, very dramatic ways, to utilize veterinary telemedicine, it's going to force, or hopefully the better, more polite verb is encourage practices to have their telemedicine solution ready, because clients are going to want to know what they can do with the practice and how to utilize this very convenient electronic tool to get the care they need for their pets. So that's kind of where things stand with practices. As far as legislation and what's allowed, of course, any discussion of veterinary telemedicine and the political process involves the discussion of the VCPR, the Veterinary Client Patient Relationship. Quick reminder to folks, many cases 10, 20, 30 years ago, veterinary practices needed to come up with some way to define the relationship between a veterinarian, a client, a pet owner, or an animal owner, and the pet, the patient. They needed to define that legally so the state, if it needed to, could take action against a veterinarian to affect their license. So the VCPR was not a consumer term. It wasn't a friendly marketing term. It wasn't a practice development term. It was a term created really by lawyers for the state to try to figure out a way that they could take some action if they needed to ever against a veterinarian. You needed to hear that little bit of legalese, apologies, and I am a lawyer, so it's hard to resist. But you needed to hear that because the whole context of the VCPR was a very limited one. And it, for some reason, seems to get expanded in the discussion about telemedicine, but it doesn't really need to. So I'm going to start with the premise. It's a limited tool that's utilized to define a relationship with a patient, potentially for legal purposes or licensing purposes. All right, there you go. That's your law school 101 for the day. Now, where we are across the country, and we have a VVCA telemedicine map that many of you rely upon. It's on our website. And what it was designed to do was make it relatively easy, no matter where you were in the country, to figure out what were the laws or regulations, laws passed by legislatures, regulations passed by veterinary medical boards that affected your freedom to use telemedicine and taking care of a pet and dealing with a pet owner. And they kind of went into these categories. There's a group of states that have said for some time, no, you cannot create a relationship with a pet owner and a pet through a telemedicine or electronic means. Texas is a good example of that. Washington's a good example of that. And there's a handful of other states. And over time, I think that will change, but there's been no effort to turn those hardcore no states, you can't do this, into yes states. So that's pretty much stayed the same. There have been a group of states that say, yes, you can. And those states include Idaho. They've included Michigan under Vet Med Board regulations, which now by a close vote have been rescinded, but I think that's an open issue. Keep your eye on Michigan. New York, which doesn't use a VCPR, it doesn't have a statute or a practice act that even talks about anything in the context of a, quote, VCPR. So telemedicine is very much alive and well from start to finish, if you will, in the state of New York. The same is true in New Jersey. They have a provision in their veterinary medical board that does allow for creating the VCPR electronically. So does Virginia. So does Florida, a major state, obviously, for population. And in the case of Florida, it doesn't allow it. Most think, we'll talk about that, my caution there, when it comes to prescriptions. Oklahoma, depending on the Vet Med Board and power, says yes or no, you can. So that state right now, the board is saying you can't use it to create a relationship. And most recently, Arizona, where I reside, and the Arizona legislature will talk about, just passed a bill clearly allowing for the telemedicine VCPR in the state. The law takes effect 90 days after the Arizona legislature concludes its business for the year. It's still technically open, so that starting date for the law being in effect now looks to be November of 2023. There's also categories that are clearly gray. When I say clearly gray, that means they're clearly ambiguous, which seems like an odd way to put it. And what's that about? There are a number of statutes that use the term you had to have seen or examined the animal to have a VCPR created. But they don't say physically examine. They don't prohibit telemedicine. So the question is, can you see or examine an animal virtually, or is that by definition or implied to mean only in person? And that's an open question. And I will tell you that some telemedicine companies treat that as a virtual examination or virtual seeing is within the boundaries of the law. And some say, no, it's not, and they take a more conservative approach. No court and no Vet Med Board and no legislature has addressed that ambiguous. It doesn't place people often in a comfortable position, and it's not my fault, but I do share the frustration that people have in those states. And our map, when you see it up again August 1, will make clear which those states are. The action in 2023 is heavily focused on 4 states. I'll do them alphabetically: Arizona, California, Colorado, and Florida. And when I say action, that's meant that there's been an effort by a group led by the Veterinary Care Association, VVCA, which I co-founded and is sponsoring this podcast. So be clear, we're not neutral on that. Led by that group, by animal welfare organizations, and in some cases by farm interests. And in Arizona, it was a fascinating burst of activity from February through April into early May. And by large numbers, I think the total combined vote was roughly about 170 to 5 in the 2 houses of the Senate and the House. And it was signed by the governor. Arizona has approved and will implement, effective in November, telemedicine VCPR. It has guardrails. That's always been the position of the Veterinary Virtual Care Association. Guardrails are necessary. Let's be smart about this. So there has to be consent by the pet owner. They have to know they have a choice. If they want to see a pet owner, or rather a veterinarian in person, they can. Not always physically possible, unfortunately. People know that that's the case. But the point is, they're given a choice. The veterinarian herself gets to make a choice. She can decide based on what she sees on the screen, FaceTime or Zoom, whatever the mechanism is. She gets to make a choice. Do I see enough? Do I know enough that I can be helpful here to get started in a relationship with a pet and with a pet owner? So those are initial guardrails. You can't prescribe a controlled substance under the Arizona law by only a telemedicine VCPR. That protects and very effectively protects against abuse of opioids and the problems associated there that might occur if someone was just having a phone engagement or some kind of a video type short form engagement. Can't do that. And prescriptions can go, in Arizona's case, for 14 days and be renewed one time for 14 days. So after nearly a month, if the situation with the pet hasn't improved, you can't use a virtual engagement to renew for what would be a third time, or prescribe for a third time for the pet. So those guardrails are in place, and we'll have a lot of eyes on Arizona next year as this bill kicks off later this fall in November. California is, I have to say, the surprise state of the year. The California VMA strongly opposes the veterinary telemedicine VCPR. The California Veterinary Medical Board opposes it, but they haven't been successful, and a legislative effort has passed through the Assembly, which is the House. In many states, it's called the House. It's called the Assembly in California, basically unanimously. It just went through the Senate committee vote this Monday, July 10. It passed unanimously. There's been an overwhelming support in California. There's 2 steps left before it's on the governor's desk in October. And one could expect right now that California will pass. So that means with Arizona and California, you have 2 states that add up to about 48 million people, which is a big number. And when you add that to the group of states already, you begin to get, you're over the 100 million Americans live in states that permit a telemedicine VCPR, which is basically a third of the country. So things are moving fast. And I think practices, but certainly pet owners in California, 40 million people are excited about, but need to get focused, effective in January if the bill gets signed, as I expect in October or early November. You've got to get ready to handle a major state that the public's going to expect that you can provide telemedicine services for care of pets. And I'll talk a bit about what's changed in those states, but that's the 2 states that have passed it. Both Colorado and Florida were in position to pass similar legislation. In the case of Florida, it passed out of the House unanimously, 109-0, which is usually a vote reserved for when you're trying to name a high school or grade school or something. Very impressive vote there. But one legislator was able to block any hearing in the Senate to even consider the bill. It's happened 2 years in a row. At some point, that logjam won't happen, but that happened this year, connected to a veterinarian that just didn't like telemedicine, felt strongly. And the legislator had a chairmanship of a committee and was able to block any consideration. In Colorado, the one veterinarian in the legislature, Representative McCormick in the Colorado House, chairs a key committee, is opposed to telemedicine and would not hold a hearing and would not let her committee consider a bill that would have allowed telemedicine VCPR, somewhat similar to Arizona, Colorado, or California. So now you have that dynamic, and how long one person can kind of put their finger into the dam and keep the water back, we'll see. But usually over time that changes, but that's the status there. You had activity in other states. Kentucky passed a bill that prohibits the telemedicine VCPR. There was no debate there, but really they kind of had that vote lined up ahead of time. And some bills in other states. What was the dynamic that's changed? And I want to conclude with just kind of who the organizations are involved in this effort now. What changed in Arizona, what changed in California has been shelters and animal welfare organizations stepping up, driven by an access to care concern. What's that access to care? They're now seeing pets returned or relinquished back to shelters and to rescues. Because why? The pet owner cannot get in to see a veterinarian. They can't, quote, access any care for their pets. And these are living, breathing beings, right? And people understand, just like for themselves, they need medical care for their pets. And if they can't provide it, people have returned their pets to shelters and rescues and said, hopefully you'll be able to care for our animal. We're not able to do so. And if there's ever a rationale that touches your heart and head to support a tool like telemedicine, it's what I just described. And those have been powerful organizations in Arizona, Arizona Humane Society, PetSmart Charities, the Southern Arizona Humane Society, really good local groups. California, from San Diego up to the northern border, you saw animal welfare groups step up. And frankly, legislators paid attention. Those are local people, local situations. It's not theoretical. And I think you're going to see animal welfare organizations increasingly take the lead. The ASPCA has been very effective nationally and have worked closely with the VVCA. The opposition remains primarily the AVMA and state VMAs that followed the lead of the AVMA and a couple of the bigger pharmaceuticals. And that's really been it. You don't see a broad movement opposing telemedicine. But in many states, that's all they need to hear is that the state VMA doesn't like it and the matter closes. So that's where we are. If it seems confusing, apologies, but it's a little bit messy now, but it's starting to clear up, and the Arizona and California votes have had a lot to do with it. Appreciate your interest in the issue, and stay tuned for the second version of Mark 5 podcast. Again, thanks for your interest. Take care.
This episode was sponsored by My Simple Pet Lab. Meet the future of pet wellness made simple by vets for pets. My Simple Pet Lab delivers pet care solutions that are fast, simple, and reliable. From vet-approved routine pet wellness tests, care kits, to over-the-counter products. Keeping your pet healthy has never been easier. Check out mysimplepetLab.com for more information.